The Newsagents.
I definitely have unfinished business. Definitely.
That was Liz Truss with her double definitely that she has unfinished business. We're going to bring you all that. Let's think of it as dessert.
Yeah, but of course we've got to have as our kind of principal fare today what's unfolded in the Middle East over the weekend, with Iran launching that attack on Israel. 300 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, all fired at Israel. But what happens now? What is next? What are the diplomatic next moves? We're going to try and unpick the pitfalls, the dangers and the risks that lie ahead. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily. And we're going to start with that extraordinary night, Saturday night, where Israelis were given hours, essentially, to prepare for what they knew was coming at them, literally coming at them. They were told at around 10 p.m. that Iran had started sending drones. And there is this extraordinary moment of kind of delay, because the news anchors were talking about the news that was going to be, and people were told about the attacks that were coming. And in the middle of this all, they actually had time to go out, to go to the shops, to restock on things that they needed, to make sure that they had their kids home, to get their, grandchildren in if they were living in places that didn't have, as most Israeli homes now do, a sort of a safe room. And so they were in this sort of suspended reality, knowing that all this was coming at them and having to think, in a way I just think we can't imagine. What will you now do with these couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours that you've got to prepare? I mean, we should say at this point, unlike many people in Gaza, unlike the Gazan population who don't get those warnings, that allowance of preparation is unlike any other kind of warfare that we ever see.
I mean, in some ways, none of it was a surprise, in the sense that once Israel had attacked, we presume it was Israel who attacked that consular building in Damascus, where there were 7 Iranian officers, 2 generals were killed, and Iran vowed revenge. You knew there was something going to happen. What shape it was the surprising bit. And that sense for the Israelis of, wow, how good is the Iron Dome? How good is the shields that we've got around us? As it turned out, they were very, very good indeed, although there are some people who say Iran scored a victory, not because missiles got through, they didn't, but because they saw where Israel's defence shield was set up and had much greater intelligence if there were a future strike against them as a result of it.
Yeah, and I guess the question that we're asking today is, what was Iran trying to do, and what will Israel do as a result of all that? Joe Biden, President Biden, has made it very clear that he thinks, to paraphrase, or maybe not to paraphrase, that Israel should take the win. In other words, Iran was trying to target, we think, the airbase, particularly the Nevatim airbase, which is where strategically they could do most damage to Israel's military. And what happened essentially was that very, very little, minuscule amounts got through the Israeli defence system. It was called the most expensive night in Israel's system, because every single bit of, I think it's called the arrow, which is the interceptor. That's when you're sort of hearing the noises are what's happening in space, delayed to Earth sort of 2 or 3 minutes later, of the arrow intercepting these drones. Every single bit costs between £2 and £3 million. You times that by your fighter jets, you times that by 300, you times that by the Iron Dome sort of system itself. But essentially, Iran was trying to A, take revenge, and B, work out where Israel's military targets were. And Israel was trying to make sure that it can still hold the line of saying, you know what, just because nothing got through doesn't mean that they didn't try. And actually, I think that will be politically where Israel ends up on this, that they will be considering a response based on what Iran tried to do, not on what it actually achieved.
The other thing that happened, and I think this is fascinating as well, is in the diplomatic space, in the sense that for weeks We on this podcast, anywhere you read it, we've been talking about Israel being isolated, standing alone in the world. It's got no friends. Even America is, pissed off with Israel. And then we see Iran launching the attack, and the Jordanians are trying to bring down the missiles, and the Saudis are doing it, and the French, and the British, and the Americans. And so, but you've also saw Iran, what a regional superpower it is, and how far its tentacles reach. That Israel was coming attacked from Iraq, from Syria, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from the Houthis in Yemen, and they were all firing under orders from Iran. And I think that does consolidate the picture of Iran as this mighty beast that actually causes a lot of fear to moderate Arab opinion as well.
Look, the last weeks and months have been dominated by questions that Israel is finding increasingly hard to answer and increasingly ugly. Is this a genocide in Gaza? Are you deliberately targeting civilians? Why do you need to kill so many women and children? Why are we selling arms to a country, to an administration that doesn't seem to be able to differentiate between legitimate terrorist targets and thousands of small children? And these have been circling, and these voices have been growing louder, and Israel has not been able to remind much of the world that it was originally the victim, on October the 7th, and so many of its citizens slaughtered and 100 or more still hostage in Gaza. And I think Saturday night, in Israel's mind, was a kind of turning the tables. It's trying to remind people that actually they are under attack. Now, I think Israel has been in a different place since October the 7th, which is that it cannot understand why people can't see that it did not bring this on itself. And it thinks that everything that's happened in Gaza was appalling, and we know that there are people on the edge or in famine now in Gaza. But I think Saturday night became the moment for Israel to say, actually, we're under attack now.
It reframed the question.
It reframed the question. Well, let's get a view now from somebody who's right in the thick of things in Jerusalem. Yaakov Katz, he's the former editor of the Jerusalem Post, and he's the author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War. And I want to go right into the heart of that with you, Yaakov, because these two sort of powers have been dancing around each other, we know, for decades. But this is the first time that Iran has actually struck Israel on sovereign territory. What effect do you think that will have over what you call the shadow war?
Well, this is definitely no longer a shadow war, right? This is it's front, right, and center for the whole world to see, because as you pointed out, the Iranians have directly attacked Israel from their territory for the first time. Until now, they've used proxies. They've launched cyber attacks. They've used Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, but they've never done it themselves. And that is what makes this so significant as an event, I think, for Iran, for Israel, and for the entire Middle East. And it really puts Israel in a very complicated dilemma, because on the one hand, there is a sense that there's a need for retaliation. There's a need for a response by Israel to show the Iran that such an attack cannot be tolerated. On the other hand, there's no doubt, and we're hearing this from our American friends and British friends and European friends, that a potential Israeli retaliation could lead to a wider conflict that no one really has an interest in with Iran right now. So Israel is still kind of contemplating what its next move should be.
Do you think there has been, in any sense, a miscalculation on Israel's part and Iran's part, with Israel miscalculating what the effect would be of their bombing, and we assume it was the Israelis who bombed that consular building in Damascus, killing those Iranian generals, and on Iran's part for thinking it could hurl 300 missiles towards Israel without it provoking a wider confrontation?
Well, I totally agree with you that Israel potentially miscalculated here. When the military intelligence brought this target to the cabinet, they had recommended in their assessment that the fallout from targeting him in Damascus would not be anything beyond the rules of engagement that we've been seeing over the last 6 months. So the assessment for the ministers, based on the intelligence analysis, was that this wouldn't lead to something greater. And I think that we saw that mistake.
What is your sense of what's going on in the cabinet talks right now, Yaakov? I mean, do you think that they're the three central members who are trying to plan what to do next? Do you think they're pulling in the same direction, or do you think that they're sort of, I don't know, fighting Netanyahu on this?
The cabinet is split to some extent. There are those on the more militant side who are pushing for an Israeli retaliation against Iran, and there are even those who have said that Israel should use this assault early Sunday morning as the legitimacy to bomb not just Iran and respond in kind to what happened, but to take out maybe even their nuclear facilities, right? Which we have all long discussed and wondered when and if that would ever happen. I think that the prime minister, the defense minister, and Minister Gantz, who are those three members that I think you were referring to, they are more inclined to work closer with the Americans and the British and the Europeans on this, and
that
try
means
to
put the brakes on.
Put the brakes on for now. But I think what we also have to recognize is that there really was an amazing regional cooperation that we saw. This does show us that there's a lot of potential here in the Middle East. And would we want to see all that go down the drain? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting point. What about Israeli public opinion? How much pressure is there downwards coming up that there has to be further action after what Iran did of firing those 300 missiles at Israeli soil?
So I don't identify, I haven't seen that kind of pressure. It's not the same, if we go back to October 7th, after the Hamas massacre in Israel, there definitely was pressure. This is different because there really was an amazing act of defense here. So there's not a lot of pressure from the Israelis to respond. And I also I'll add one other point to that, John, is that the Israelis, let's still remember, we still are a bit of a scared and scarred people. While the world has moved on from October 7th, the Israeli people are still very much stuck in that moment. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there's still 133 people who are being held as hostages in Gaza. And it's hard for Israel to move beyond that. So that what that did is shatter Israeli confidence. And therefore, if you probably ask your average Israeli, they would say, hey, keep us out of another war. We don't want this right now.
Well, let's speak now to friend of the podcast, Tim Marshall, author. His latest book, The Future of Geography, kind of has a sort of relevance for some of what we're talking about, because it's talking about the battle that's going on in space. And Tim, some of that was fought in space at the weekend.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, because any modern war now between states involves space. And some of the Iranian missiles were in space when they were taken down. But we can move on from that. And I agree with you, it is a huge success. And it's one, from the Israeli perspective, they needed after the humiliation of the slaughter of October 7th, because they know that in their neighborhood, you mustn't ever look weak. You mustn't ever look like a paper tiger. Conversely, of course, that's why Iran had to do something. April the 1st, hit their consulate in Damascus, killed 7 Revolutionary Guards, including 2 generals, with their justification being, oh, well, it's a terror headquarters. But Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran said this is akin to attacking our sovereign soil. Now, actually, it's a bit of a myth. An embassy and consulate are not sovereign soil, but they're perceived as such. So, of course, the Iranians had to respond. And the big question, is it 1-1 and we call it a draw? Or does someone go for victory?
I guess the way Israel would be considering their response is based on what Iran tried to do, not the fact that they failed to do it, right?
Yeah. This is where it gets really complicated. And it's where, I don't know if it's a game of poker or some sort of other card game analogy, but this is certainly calibrated. I mean, we've discussed this in the past. After October 7th, Hezbollah had to show solidarity with their Palestinian brethren in Gaza, but not to the extent that they get drawn into a war with Israel. And so they calibrated their response by a certain amount of rockets fired at a certain amount of targets, causing a certain amount of deaths, but not X amount, which would then trigger a war. the Iranians have really upped it. And you're right to look at it in this, that, Israel, for the first time in 30 years since the first Gulf War, has been attacked by a state firing missiles, lots of them into it. So can they just say, well, didn't cause much damage, or do they have to go back? I just think because the Iranians, I think, signaled, and there is a lot of dispute about this. Some people say, no, they meant to cause massive damage. That's why they flooded the airspace with so many missiles and drones. I don't agree. The Iranians are pretty good and they're pretty clever. And they must have known that hardly anything would get through, but they'd made their point. So if the Israelis can read that and say, yeah, they had to have their moment, they've had it, we don't need to go all the way into Iranian airspace. And as I said, that's my guess. But there's only 3 people that are really, well, in the military in Israel. It's the 3-member war cabinet that are discussing this every day and looking at the military options with their generals. And they're the only ones who really know, and actually they don't know yet.
But what about the diplomacy of some of this? I kind of, the old Napoleon dictum is that, don't interrupt your enemy if they're making a mistake. Yeah. And what Iran has done by firing these missiles is kind of solidified the pro-Israel coalition, or solidified moderate Arab opinion, so that you see the Jordanians getting involved in shooting down missiles, the Saudis getting involved, and that has given Netanyahu significantly an important win.
Yeah, and taken attention away from what is happening in Gaza. And the French, the British and the Americans and the Jordanians, as you say, and the Saudis all helped Israel on Saturday night. But all of them, of course, have got skin in the game in some respects. I mean, Jordan, for example, the Iranians are having a huge push in Jordan at the moment. They know that more than half the Jordanian population is of Palestinian origin. And they know this is fertile ground. And just as they mostly control Hamas in Gaza, they would like to be able to build up groups inside Jordan with a view to changing the regime in Jordan, which would then be more comfortable with Tehran. So that's why the Jordanians got involved. But you're right, the diplomacy of it is really interesting, and at the diplomatic level, most of the sympathy goes with Israel. And it's another reason, I think, to pocket it, because if you then go on and escalate, and at which point the Iranians also have to escalate, because that's how this deadly game is played, it will end up in a war, and I don't think either side actually wants that.
What do you think the end game is for Iran? I mean, do they consider Israel a greater enemy than Saudi, greater than America? What is the end game for Iran here?
What Iran has done very well in the past 2 decades and accumulating, they have this concept of the unity of the arenas. And the arenas are everywhere where they have their forward bases and they have their proxy military. So after the invasion of Iraq, that becomes an arena for them, because the Shia militias in Iraq answer mostly to Tehran. So that's one arena. Next door, they helped out Assad. And the Assad regime is led mostly by a fairly distant Shia offshoot. And so that's an arena and a space that they can use. And then you move round to Lebanon and to Hezbollah, of course. Then you move down to Gaza and Hamas, and then all the way around to the bottom and Yemen and the Houthis. And they call this the Ring of Fire, which at any point that Ring of Fire could all rain fire in on Israel. That's what they're trying to do with the end game, that they destroy what they call the Zionist entity. The problem has come that what they're doing is playing in Arab Sunni regions. And so all of the Arab Sunni countries also fear Iran, which is why they're beginning to make their peace with Israel and helping them to block Iranian expansion. So Iran's end game is to dominate the Middle East and get rid of Israel. The Sunni states, who used to agree they wanted to get rid of Israel, now they just don't care as much. So I think the Iranians have bitten off more than they can chew in that.
Tim, that's so interesting what you say. And also I'm interested in when you say that Israel has no interest in a full-scale regional conflict, whereas arguably Israel has been going on for the last 20 years about the growth of Iran,
Yes.
their destabilising effect in the region, exactly the ring of fire that you say that they have created. And that what they are really trying to do is to draw America into that regional conflict to finally neuter Iran.
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I understand the argument. And I think if they thought they really could do that, they would, because they do genuinely, in an existential manner, fear an Iranian nuclear bomb. Now, again, there's all sorts of discussions. Are the Iranian leadership, the Ayatollahs, rational, or are they religious maniacs that would like to, bring the world to an end in order to get rid of the Jews? There's this big debate about that, and from the Israeli perspective, they would love to take that out, which is why and it's a very big if, and I don't think it'll happen, but we get stuff wrong. If they did go all out in this round, they would probably take the opportunity to go after the nuclear sites, but they're busy. The Israelis are busy. They may be busy in the north on the Lebanon border, and the Americans have said openly, we're not going to help you if you go on the offensive. And the diplomatic sympathy that they have, I think, would also dissolve. So I agree with you that might be a long-term ambition. And the Americans are also very concerned about the possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon. But I don't think that's what they're doing at the moment. And the Americans are still trying diplomacy when it comes to the nuclear file.
So interesting.
Tim, fascinating. Thank
great
you
to have
so
your
much.
thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz Truss tweeted this morning, read about my final days in Downing Street in the Daily Mail today. Jess Phillips MP tweeted back saying, also known as her initial days in Downing Street. It's very hard to know what to think about a book that covers a 49-day premiership, which an awful lot of people have already forgotten about and only remember for all that went wrong. And this is Liz Truss's attempt to say, hang on, there's another version of events.
Yeah, because she has made very clear to our colleague Iain Dale on LBC, and you can hear that in full tonight, that she is not going anywhere. And by that we mean she's not gone. She is zombie Truss, ready for the rematch. Just listen to him talking to her about her future political career.
I definitely have unfinished business, definitely. And I think the Conservative Party has unfinished business. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we haven't done enough to reverse the Blair legacy. I see myself as part of the Conservative movement. We've set up the new organisation, Popular Conservatives, advocating these ideas. And that's what I want to do. I want to build the support for those ideas. And I think once you have enough support for those ideas, enough understanding of what the problem is, then people emerge who are ready to take leading roles. But I don't feel we're there yet.
But I know you haven't ruled it out.
Well, it's never wise to rule anything out in politics, is it?
Wait, emerge to take leading roles. Was that it? Is she emerging? Is she taking another leading role?
Well, I mean, this is somebody who clearly feels that there is a comeback awaiting her, and that, come the next Tory leadership contest, presumably after a general election, when it may be that there are not many Tory MPs left, and one of the safest seats in the country is hers. And so, don't rule it out. And she is trying to say, I was the libertarian who was giving the British people unpalatable truths, and the system didn't want to hear it. I was right, they were wrong.
It's interesting because the other excerpts from the book that we've sort of read over the weekend have suggested that she was really unhappy as Prime Minister. It's a bit like listening to somebody screaming for 3 minutes on a roller coaster. I'm going to die, I'm going to be sick. And then getting off it and going, oh, that was great fun. I think I'll have another go. And she sort of goes into some detail about how lonely it was in Downing Street, doesn't she? And
cut off from the world.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I did have a certain amount of sympathy with her saying she felt quite imprisoned, and little things, just little life bits of life laundry you couldn't make work. You didn't know where to get your shopping delivered. You didn't know how to get medicine in the middle of the night. You couldn't go for a run on your own without sort of taking your bodyguards with you. You couldn't even get a sort of a haircut or a hair and makeup appointment when you had to go out and face the cameras. And so a bit of me on a very sort of, I don't know, female, human level sort of thought, yeah, God, that actually sounds ghastly.
But at the same time, I think it points to the sort of naivety, plausibility, kind of that this. She was never born for this role. I mean, it was kind of. She was the prime minister, the accidental prime minister, that comes to power off the back of the sort of implosion of Boris Johnson.
But not that accidental, in the sense she had 4 months to get used to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, she'd had senior posts and she'd been the foreign secretary and all the rest of it.
Probably knew her way around the building.
But exactly. So there's a bit of me that doesn't quite buy this whole shtick of her as the outsider and the little person. I mean, she did, she's the children of academics. She goes to Oxford, does PPE. She becomes a Tory minister, rises up the Tory ranks. I mean, she's not come from nowhere. And so when she says, oh, golly, it was all terrible and it was all a bit shocking, I think, come on, you knew the ropes. I
think she does say, the Queen died on my second day, and that was a bit shocking to me. But I think, that's the headline of that. You can sense, I'd be feeling quite superstitious at this point if the longest serving monarch, the one woman who everyone in the country kind of revered and adored, suddenly disappears, and you think, oh, blimey.
Have I killed her off?
Yeah, what have I done now? Yeah, I'm not sure she had that level of self-awareness, but there is a bit of, I just think that loneliness comes through, actually.
Well, I remember when she came out onto Downing Street and sort of gave this very, very inadequate, I thought, kind of response to the death of Britain's longest serving monarch, and it was just. She came to the throne in 19... She was born in... And it was like a sort of...
But she knows she's not good at emoting. She knows she's not good at oratory.
Get someone who can write this stuff. I just thought it was the kind of visible sign that this woman is out of her depth. And everything that happened since sort of confirmed to me that she was out of her depth. And, look, the book will come out. It's interesting that there are people around who are starting to say, well, maybe we should rethink some of the Truss legacy. And maybe she don't. Well, there are one or two people who've said, it needs to be reconsidered. And, there are voices out there that are kind of, there's a bit of rehabilitation going on.
Of her or of the policies? I think there are people saying, let's not abandon whatever her economic variety was. But there are people who don't want her in charge of it.
Yeah, but I think there's a bit of both going on in tandem. That she is the exponent, the arch exponent in the Conservative Party at the moment of her brand of popcorn or libertarian conservatism. And, she clearly still thinks that she's there, she's a player. And, the thing I always thought that was remarkable was her sort of imperviousness to criticism. And that is still there. That is still intact. She still believes that she can come back even after millions of people in this country now face far higher mortgages than they needed to because of the way she went about that mini budget.
Let's just listen to another clip from Iain's interview with her. This is what we call the quick fire. Just a whole series of rapid questions. You're not meant to think too long about the answers.
The naughtiest thing you've ever done?
Crash the economy. No? I know that wasn't her like it.
And don't say run through a wheat field.
I don't think it's worse than that. But I don't think I'm not saying anything else.
Okay. Night in or night out?
Night out.
Where do you like going? What do you like to do on a night out?
I like going
crashing the economy.
Pubs, that sort of thing.
Last time you cried?
Crashing the economy.
When I crashed the economy.
Yesterday.
Why?
Worried about my book, I think.
I get the feeling that's not quite the truth.
It is the truth.
Really?
Is the truth.
What were you worried about?
What on earth would somebody who'd only spent 49 days in power and then tried to write a biography about saving the West be worried about?
Yeah, there's nothing to worry about. The record stands for itself.
Right. So Donald Trump has tried his hardest to get this criminal trial delayed, but ultimately failed. And as things stand, the jury is now being selected to mark the first ever criminal trial of a former United States president. And this is over the Stormy Daniels, you can call it the hush money case or the election money case, the campaign financing case. But essentially, this will take a few weeks now to get a jury in place, after which we will see Trump in the dock.
We will. I mean, whether he takes the stand, whether he kind of gives evidence is a moot point. I mean, he's saying now he will. I think his lawyers will kind of want him to say as little as possible in court. But yeah, the jury selection will go on. And of course, now that the trial has been set, Donald Trump is now putting it around that it's impossible for me to get a fair trial because everyone has got so strong views on it. Well, Donald Trump has been the one who's been going around calling the judge a crook and corrupt, the prosecutor corrupt, the legal system in chaos. It's all being done by Joe Biden and his crooked Justice Department. So if they're finding it hard to be entirely neutral, well, of course, Donald Trump has done so much to create the atmosphere and the atmospherics around this particular case. And of course, if you're the Trump lawyer, you're going to want to look at the jurors that seem to be a bit blue collar, like Fox News and all the rest of it. And if you're the prosecutors, you want nice women who listen to MSNBC and maybe a bit more liberal minded.
I mean, presumably all those kinds of voters would not be allowed to be part of a jury. I'm asking this genuinely. I do not know how you go about finding somebody with a neutral view on Donald Trump or his potential criminal wrongdoing.
Yes, and that is the problem. And that is why Donald Trump is arguing, I can't get a fair trial in Manhattan because so many people are Democrat voters. Surely you have to have trust in the American system of justice, which Donald Trump, when it's going against him, absolutely doesn't. When he's litigating like crazy, of course, he absolutely does. But on this particular point, I mean, they'd have to have been under a rock for the past 6 years not to have a view on anything that has happened in America in the last 6 years. But I suppose you say, look, we listen to the evidence, we weigh the kind of what's being said, and we don't go in with any predetermined conclusions. But it will be a battle getting the jurors appointed and the 6 reserve jurists who they have to appoint as well, who will be listening to this case.
We'll be back with a lot more on that case and more on the News Agents USA tomorrow.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.